this. Okay, so in this presentation for our 5th week in ECHD 2435, I'm going to talk about children with disabilities, and we could identify those children in a variety of ways, but the ways that I'm going to talk about them are based on the U.S. Department of Education's categories of children who have a right to receive special education or related services, and that's about 10% of the children in the United States. There are a variety of categories that the Department of Ed uses, and they're broken down in this pie chart. The red numbers there are Hamilton County numbers. The black numbers are national numbers in 1,000s. So the largest number nationally is that group of children with specific learning disabilities. That's about 2,431,000 children, and that's about 37.5% of the children nationally that receive special services. And a little bit of a difference in Hamilton County, where the single largest group are children who uh, receive services for speech and language impairments. And those are the two groups that I'm going to talk about today. But you'll see there are a number of other groups that we'll talk about in a later session. Children with specific learning disabilities, there's a variety of different clusters here of learning disabilities. There's not one single type of learning disability. This is talking about a group, a cluster. But what they share in common is that children who are diagnosed with a learning disability have a minimum IQ level that they can perform their school-related demands, but they're still having significant difficulty in completing those school-related demands. And it's not because of something else, so it's an exclusion of other conditions. In general, for learning disabilities, boys are more likely to be classified than girls. And part of that may be that boys actually have more learning disabilities, but it also, at least some of that number, is that boys make themselves noticed more than girls do in our culture. So if boys are having a difficult time, they tend to act out. And girls who are having a hard time, they tend to turn that inward. And so they may not be as noticed, and so they may be missed. And that's because it's difficult to diagnose a learning disability um, because they're hidden. They're not things that we have a blood test for. They're not things that you necessarily have a real clear observation for. And they're things that children may try to hide. For example, the most common learning disability is dyslexia, which is a problem learning to read with decoding the different letters. So for learning disabilities in general, the main feature is this distance between what children are capable of achieving and what they are, the level they're performing at, and that is not caused by another disability. So dyslexia is the most prevalent learning disability in children. That's that impairment in learning to read and spell. Dyscalculia is a similar situation with math computation, and also uh, attention deficit disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Those fall within the umbrella of learning disabilities in children. We know that there is a genetic component to learning disabilities through studies of identical twins. We know that some brain differences in how the brain processes information may be passed on through either genes or through the environment or through an interaction between the two. For example, we know that when reading, children with dyslexia have different brain patterns compared to other children who do not have dyslexia while they're reading. And the difference we see in the left side of the cerebral cortex, especially the temporal lobe, and we'll talk about those physiological parts of the brain more when we get to physical development of children. We also see differences in the electrical, the strength of the electrical impulses that are observed in the brain. And we see this through studies of what are called event-related potentials. This is sort of how strong that electrical impulse is that is connecting neurons in the brain. So when children who are above average readers, when those when those the event-related potentials are measured, they show strong ones, and they show them more concentrated in a specific area of the brain on the left-hand side. Um, that indicates that there's some differences in what's called lateralization, which is the use of the left side of the brain versus the right side of the brain that may be related to reading problems. And again, we'll talk more about the physiology of the brain as we go this semester. Now, children do not just mature out of learning disabilities. They don't just outgrow them. Sometimes people will describe observing that because children have learned ways to compensate for that learning disability, and so they're able to adapt to the needs of the environment. Schools can provide special education programs and services that include modifying the curriculum into smaller chunks and smaller steps, or giving more time to finish schoolwork or exams to accommodate for children with learning disabilities. Let's talk about that other group of learning disabilities that includes attention deficit and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You've probably seen or heard those words used kind of interchangeably, and for a lot of times they are, but there's a little bit of difference between how the two words are used or the two terms are used. In ADD, children consistently show a difficulty in focusing their attention, shifting it away from things that that are distracting them from what they need to be doing on a task, and focusing it on the things that they need to in order to complete the task. So ADHD, we see that inattention as well as either hyperactivity or impulsivity. So hyperactivity is sort of always being in motion. Impulsivity is a lack of being able to regulate or delay gratification. So ADHD involves that inattention plus hyperactivity or impulsivity. It could be one or both in a lot of different situations. It's not only on the playground. It's not only in math class. It's not only the hour before lunch when children are hungry. It's across a lot of different settings. And usually this is first diagnosed soon after children enter school. Uh, it's not appropriate to diagnose ADD or ADHD for preschool age children because they all have behaviors that would fit uh, in under that kind of description. Uh, Usually about second or third, especially third grade, the demands of school become such that children can't compensate, and you will see this is usually when that diagnosis is made, when those behaviors are other children who do not have ADD, ADHD are able to meet the demands of the environment, whereas those children who do are struggling. There are many possible causes here. There's seems to be a genetic linkage. There's ADD and ADHD seems to run in families. Physiologically, we know that there are differences in the frontal lobe of the brain, and that seems to be a really particularly important part of the brain in terms of ADD and ADHD. This is a part of the brain that's associated with self-control and self-regulation. It's a part of the brain that matures uh, during those early elementary school years. Uh, and it seems to be an important area of the brain in terms of gaining self-control and self-regulation. For a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD, it's important that children undergo uh, extensive evaluations. This shouldn't be a diagnosis that's made very quickly or based on only a few observations. Stimulant drugs can be used to treat ADHD, and the reason that those stimulant drugs can be effective is because increases the ability of that frontal lobe to uh, become more active, and so in that way to uh, regain some of that self-regulation, some of that self-control. There's controversy associated with those drugs like albuterol or Ritalin. Um, there are some voices who will say they feel those drugs are overprescribed or they're just prescribed kind of in a perfunctory way, and those drugs can be abused as well. Uh, and I also want to be clear that those stimulant drugs do not cure uh, ADD or ADHD. They can improve a child's ability or even an adult's ability to meet the demands that are placed upon them, but it's not a cure. Uh, Having said that, there are many people who really benefit from those stimulant drugs, and they're able to uh, meet demands that they might not otherwise be able to meet. So, the usual treatment and what seems to be the best treatment isn't a drug in isolation or isn't just a prescription for a drug. It's the stimulant medication combined with ongoing counseling or therapy and a behavior management plan at school. And so all three of these things, when used together, show the best outcomes for children uh, who are diagnosed with ADD or an ADHD. All right, so in addition to those learning disabilities, there is another big group of what are called speech and language disorders. And speech disorders involve children's production of speech in ways that others can understand their attempts to communicate. Language disorders are children's ability to understand and process the language that's directed to them. So we usually say speech and language together, but these are separable. Um, and these are things that can be, some children may have a difficulty with speech while others may have difficulty with language. So some common speech disorders include articulation disorders, and that's when we have a difficulty pronouncing certain sounds. Articulation disorders, for example, a child can't pronounce the th, the sound. Voice disorders are when a child's voice is too hoarse or too loud or harsh, or the pitch is so high or so low that they're difficult to understand. Fluency disorder, this is what's commonly called stuttering. This can make it difficult for a child to speak and be understood. And alalia, which is a speech delay when a child does not make the attempts to verbally communicate that we normally see. Um, I want to say something else here. Articulation disorders, particularly, can have uh, an important developmental issue. Many children, when they are preschoolers, have difficulty pronouncing some of the sounds in a given language. It's not until speech and language professionals will have timelines when they can look at here is the age where most children are able to correctly pronounce this sound, and so they can evaluate if that's actually a developmental issue that the child may simply mature out of, or if it's more of a concern that could benefit from specific therapy. Apraxia occurs when a person knows what they want to say, but they can't make that word. Uh, it's because the links between the area of the brain that is thinking the language and the areas of the brain which control the muscles to produce speech are disrupted. So you see this, for example, following a stroke or a head injury. So, for example, after a stroke, a person might be recovering and they want to change the channel on the TV. And so they want to say, please hand me the remote control. And what they say is, please hand me the canoe. And you say, what? And they say, the canoe. I need the canoe to change the channel. Please hand me the canoe. And I don't understand. How could I hand you a canoe? And so the person writes it down and they say, please hand me the remote. And you say, And what is it you want me to hand you? And they say, the canoe. So in apraxia, there's this breakdown between knowing the word and being able to produce the word. Aphasia is a little different. This is when there's been damage to the speech centers of the brain, and so there's difficulty in forming uh, the words. And so in this case, instead of replacing the word canoe with remote, the person with aphasia may not be able to think of that word at all. A language integration disorder happens. This is really more of a receptive issue. The child has a level of hearing. It's not a problem with their hearing level. They're able to hear the sound, but when the message of the sound reaches the parts of the brain that interprets the sound, they have difficulty decoding what those words mean. And we see two words, and this is a whole wall of words here, so I'm not going to read all this to you, but I'll ask you to go back and read these in the PowerPoints on your own. Language processing disorder and auditory processing disorder, people will sometimes use those words kind of interchangeably, and they both relate to children having that typical level of hearing in terms of being able to hear a sound, but then difficulty interpreting what that sound means. Language processing disorder is more particular uh, to decoding language, whereas auditory processing disorder is more general, interpreting sounds. But again, you'll often see those used pretty interchangeably. Uh, so here the child has an appropriate level of being able to hear the sound, but it's difficult for them to make sense of what the sound means, to decode it into language. I'm going to stop there for now. Let's see.